Some new polling data out this morning shows some statewide primary races are likely to head to a runoff, while poll results out earlier this week suggest we could be in store for a tight race for U.S. Senate later this year. To discuss those results, we're joined now by the report's co-authors Mark Jones, political science fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, and Renee Cross, senior director of the Hobby School of Public Affairs here at the University of Houston. Mark, Renee, welcome.
Good morning.
Thanks, Craig.
Let's start with the new results just out this morning. What do they tell us about the major party races for governor, attorney general, and other statewide races?
Well, I think on the Republican side, one of the marquee races is that attorney general race, where Chip Roy has a vote intention of 33%, followed by Mays Middleton with 23%, Joan Huffman with 13%, and Aaron Reitz with 6%, with 25% undecided. It's looking like it's going to go to a runoff. Right now, we'd say that runoff would be between Roy and Middleton. Down in terms of the race of controller, Don Huffines has a vote intention of 33%, Christy Craddock at 21%, the current interim controller, Kelly Hancock at 13%, and Michael Berland at 4% with 29% undecided. Once again, looks like it's going to a runoff. Hancock has a lot of money in Governor Abbott's support, so it's quite possible that by spending that, he could leapfrog Craddock and get into the runoff, but we are looking at a runoff there.
Are there any statewide races where you anticipate somebody getting a majority and not heading to a runoff?
Well, in the ag commissioner race on the Republican side, there are only two candidates. Right now, Sid Miller, who's not Governor Abbott's favorite. He's supporting Nathan Sheets. Looks like he has a good lead. They're spending money on Sheets' behalf. And over on the Democratic side, Gina Hinojosa has a commanding lead, vote intention of 37%. Second place is Chris Bell with 7%. So she's looking pretty good, although the vote's really fragmented among the other candidates. So she does have to work a little bit to make sure she crosses 50%. But there's no doubt whatsoever she's going to finish in first place by a long shot and most likely win without having to go to a runoff.
Renee, Mark mentioned Texas Attorney General candidate Aaron Reitz among the candidates there just now. Reitz this week said that if he wins, he will try to revoke Texas Democratic State Representative Jean Woo's citizenship.
Yes.
Why, and can he do that?
No, he cannot do that. But why is Representative Woo, the conversation Representative Woo had with other Democrats talking about if people of color banded together, essentially Democrats could win. And he did use the unfortunate phrase of take over the country, take over the government. And Reitz has jumped on that, saying that he is un-American, and he should have his citizenship revoked, and alluded to there may be some discrepancies in his citizenship application. Wu came over here as a kid, and they left China to escape communism. So the fact that they're basically calling him a communist is probably a stretch. But no, unless there is very blatant lies on that application, that he can't have his citizenship revoked.
Mark, you also released data earlier this week about the much-discussed U.S. Senate primary races. What did you learn about those?
There on the Republican side, we found Ken Paxton with a 7-point lead over John Cornyn, and then Cornyn having a 14-point advantage over Wesley Hunt. Once again, that's a race that very likely is going to go to a runoff. Right now, we'd say that runoff is going to be between Ken Paxton and John Cornyn. On the Democratic side, it's a very close race. Jasmine Crockett has an 8-point advantage over James Tallarico, but Tallarico remains well within striking distance. And after the survey came out, but in the period since then, the Tallarico Super PAC has been dumping a considerable amount of money attacking Jasmine Crockett for the first time with some negative attack ads. And Crockett now is finally starting to do her own advertisements. But I think we're going to have a very competitive, strenuous campaign between now and March 3rd. That's a race that, unless it's on a knife's edge, because there's one candidate that's getting almost no votes, Ahmad Hassan, it's not likely not to go to a runoff, and it'll be decided on March 3rd.
Back to the Republican candidates, am I right that some of the other polling that's been out there so far about this race showed much tighter contest between Paxton and Cornyn than what your survey found, Renee?
Yes, a lot of the other polls had him within, I don't know, three points. However, of course, with polling, you should always look at it as a one snapshot view, and you should average it over many polls over time.
And I'd note that some of the polls hold it having Hunt close are funded by Hunt supporters who have a vested interest in Hunt appearing much closer to Cornyn than, say, a poll that shows him at a distance.
You also asked about direct head-to-head matchups in the fall for various combinations of candidates. The results seem to suggest that whoever wins the Republican and Democratic primaries, the general election is likely to be fairly tight. Which combination of candidates seem to result in, at least at this moment, the most competitive matchup?
Paxton has 45% against Crockett's 43%. And that's well within, the margin of error. So that will be a competitive race if everything stays as is.
Is there one that's clearly much less competitive than the other combinations at the moment?
They're all very competitive.
Yeah, it's all between about 1 and 4 points. Wesley Hunt does slightly better than Cornyn and Paxton. But right now, at least, and this is, of course, before the actual November campaign has even started, we aren't seeing much difference between Tallarico or Crockett in terms of their performance against Paxton or Cornyn. And we're not seeing much difference in Paxton and Cornyn's performance vis-a-vis Crockett or Tallarico. That is, right now, it's pretty much of a wash. And I think we have to keep in mind that people are heavily anchored, especially now, by their partisanship, and it's very tough to move them. Now, of course, regardless of who's the nominee, we're going to see $50, $100, $150 million spent by each side attacking the others. So numbers could shift a little bit, but right now it looks pretty even.
So really, we've got a primary election next month, likely runoffs to follow that, and a long way to go before the general election. So while this is a snapshot of head-to-head matchups, maybe we really don't look too seriously at those numbers.
No, I mean, it's a good idea to sort of see where they are, but it's not surprising that they aren't all that different simply because people are primarily voting now when they respond based on their pure partisanship, not so much on individual factors. And that's also just before people have gone on the attack. So we haven't seen all of the attack ads against Jasmine Crockett or against James Tallarico, and both of them are going to provide lots of fodder to work for the Republicans to work with. And of course, if Ken Paxton's the Republican nominee, you could fill a semi with all of the information and baggage that you could use against him.
Well, it's 7 to 8 months away, which is an eternity in politics. However, I do think that many of these Republican ads are going to be replayed and used in some manner in the general election because the Republican primary for this position has been bloody.
Mark, how do you gather this data? Who do you ask, and how do you know it's an accurate reflection of where people across the state are?
Well, it's a representative sample. It's based off a panel from YouGov, and it's designed to be representative of Texas registered voters, then likely voters, then people who are likely to turn out in the respective Democratic and Republican primaries or in the November general election, depending on which race you're focused on. We have a good track record of getting close. We remember, I think for Trump, we've missed by a couple points in one election, a few points in another. But it's always, as Renee mentioned, it's a snapshot of where we are at a specific point in time. But the industry has a pretty good track record of providing sort of good benchmarks of where people are. Primaries are always the toughest to poll in because in the general election, you have the anchor of partisanship around which to look at your estimates. You don't have that in a primary because people, have mostly all Democrats and mostly all Republicans. And so and people tend to be a little less fixed in terms of their support for individual candidates. It can move around more because they aren't anchored by partisanship. It's more on individual factors, like with Tallarico and Crockett, where they don't differ too much on policy. It's more of a vibes and thinking about how they would perform in November that's driving the behavior of a lot of people.
In congressional election news, former Houston City Council member Amanda Edwards formally suspended her campaign this week, even though her name remains on the ballot for the 18th district race. This essentially means it's a two-candidate race between two sitting congressmen, Al Green and the just elected and seated Christian Menifee. Renee, remind us why they're running for the same seat in next month's primary.
It all comes down to redistricting. Al Green was redistricted out of the 9th, what was then the 9th, and most of his CD9 was put into Congressional District 18. Of course, we know that Christian Menifee won the not only the special and the special runoff to represent CD18 for the rest of the year. However, it is now pitting two sitting congressional members against each other.
And again, different maps. So he's been campaigning up to this point, or at least up until the point of his election in the primary runoff, or the special election runoff, rather, under one map. And now he's running over the course of this next month under a different map, and that's going to include whole chunks of neighborhoods that he hadn't been campaigning in before.
This is just yet another example how this year is going to have so much confusion at the ballot box.
Mark, how are these new congressional maps impacting election administrators' efforts ahead of next month's primaries?
Well, it's a lot of headaches. They've had to effectively reconfigure things to make sure that everything was set up correctly, and it definitely has delayed the mailing out of voter registration cards, which you aren't required, and actually we have voter ID now in Texas, so you actually need your photo ID. But it's just an example that it's just one more headache that election administrators have had to deal with. And Harris County Clerk Tanisha Hudspeth has had her share. She's had to simultaneously manage the special election while preparing for the general election. And then to top things off, she has a special election for the City of Houston City Council in April. So the Harris County Elections Administration group has their work cut out for them. They're doing a lot this spring.
Mark, right now, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi is testifying before the House Judiciary Committee about the Justice Department targeting President Trump's political opponents and how justice has handled the Epstein files, which still have not been fully released or unredacted where they should be. What do you expect we will hear today from Bondi?
I think you're likely to see a full-throated defense of the Trump administration. She really can't do anything else when you're a Trump appointed official, AG, Defense, State Department. Your goal out there is to defend the Trump administration, and regardless of what you may personally believe, everything the Trump administration is doing is correct in her eyes, and Democrats are essentially attacking the president needlessly. And I suspect she'll probably return to some refrains of how Biden and the Biden administration, in her eyes, targeted Trump administration officials. So it'll be a combination of we're not really targeting people, but even if you think we are, we're not doing as much as the Biden administration. On the Epstein files, that's just a mess that it's going to keep on effectively as plaguing us in terms of more and more information gets released, but it's not being released in at the speed that people want. And then every time, with every sort of additional release, there are more and more people we're seeing get ensnared by it. So I think it probably has to be really nerve-wracking for a whole host of people out there who know that there's potentially some information about them. Most recently I saw the president of Bard College got, and they're getting ensnared because they almost all are saying, before, at least in the past, they've said, well, we didn't have any connections, or I went to the island, but I was sick the whole time and I stayed in a bungalow. I'm not even sure it was on the island. And then, then the emails pop out saying, oh, thanks, I loved it here, and thanks for the gift, and it was remarkable. So I think for a lot of members of the elite, the Epstein file continues to be a headache that just keeps going on. And it's the same for Bondi and Justice, because everything they do is going to be under sort of a microscope. And regardless of what they release or don't release, it's going to anger people.
Renee, what seems frustrating to a lot of folks is the redactions, that they'll release files and there'll be a lot of black lines in it that you can't read through. And more what we're learning is that once some of those become unredacted, they weren't actually protecting any victims of sex trafficking, as was the instruction. They're protecting others who maybe don't deserve that protection.
I think that's exactly right. I'm sure the Sharpie company is quite happy with these files coming out. Um, the victims appear to be, I believe, coalescing a little bit more, and I think with time they are going to be forced to come out and, by name, to overcome some of this that certainly appears like it's a cover-up.
On Tuesday, immigration agency leaders appeared before Congress to face questions about tactics used by officers on the ground in Minneapolis. This was the first such questioning since 2 U.S. citizens were shot and killed there by federal immigration officers. This comes as congressional funding expires Friday for the Department of Homeland Security. Are lawmakers any closer to reaching agreement on how to revise federal immigration officers' procedures and tactics, as well as fund the department?
I don't think so. Both parties are digging in their heels. And even though the Democrats have had discussions with President Trump, it appears that the Democrats are just not going to give in and fund the Department of Homeland Security if some of these concessions aren't made. No mask, for example. Republicans don't want to negotiate. So I, at this point, expect that the Department of Homeland Security will not be funded by the deadline on Friday. However, we need to keep in mind that ICE, which is what they're arguing over, right? ICE is funded. They have literally billions of dollars. So, if anything, this certainly is being used as a political maneuver for later.
Well, and it could amp up pressure if we see other elements within the Department of Homeland Security not be funded, like, for instance, TSA workers at airports.
Right. That's the key sticking point here. If it was just ICE, then effectively they could probably come to a compromise of they don't fund ICE, but the Trump administration has the billions from the big, beautiful bill, and they just keep funding it. But the reality is if Homeland Security is not funded, the thing that people would notice probably first is TSA security officials and air traffic controllers sort of not coming to work. One middle strategy that some are brokering now is another continuing resolution to say give them 2 more weeks. It may be possible that while some of the Democratic leaders don't want to do that, there's enough Democratic rank and file that will cross over and say, okay, we're not supporting the current status quo, but what we will do is give us a week or 2 more to negotiate, and then then we'll see what they come up with.
Are you surprised that Republicans are holding such a hard line on specifically masks when every other law enforcement agency, federal, state, local, anywhere in the United States, doesn't do that?
It's certainly inconsistent logic. Because if that truly is an issue, that the identification of these agents could put them in a precarious position of doxing, for example, why would that not be the case with the local folks, the state folks, and so forth? I did hear, in fact, this morning on NPR, that there was one discussion of having ICE agents wear a QR code. So if someone felt like they were out of line, they could photograph the QR code, and while they would not learn the identity of that person could still be reported.
Okay. We learned Tuesday that an FBI investigation into the 2020 election in Georgia's Fulton County was initiated by a lawyer working for the Trump administration who also aided Trump's efforts to try and overturn the election years ago. This is according to an affidavit by FBI Special Agent Hugh Raymond Evans. It also led to a judge to sign off on a search warrant of Fulton County's elections hub back on January 28th. That's when hundreds of boxes and other materials were seized. But the affidavit relies on already disproven claims about the 2020 election. And Fulton County's ballots were counted back then 3 separate times. So, Mark, I ask you, why is this still a thing?
Unfortunately, the president still sticks with the narrative that he lost the election in 2020 due to fraud, and is focused on Georgia, even though, as you note, Georgia had paper ballots back then, or they had essentially voter verifiable paper trails back then. Then Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who has done a great job there in Georgia, they counted them. Fulton County counted them. There's no evidence whatsoever, but at the end of the day, the president still is sticking with his narrative that he was cheated out of the election back in 2020 due to fraud. And as long as he sticks to that narrative, there are going to be people out there who are going to be pushing that narrative, either because they agree with him, to support him, or to curry favor with him.
And it also serves to keep voter fraud or threats of voter fraud in the news, in people's consciousness. So they are potentially setting it up to say, okay, this fraud happened in 2020. What's going to happen this year? So if, let's say, the November elections don't go the way the presidents hope they go, they're going to have all this evidence, they call evidence, from previous elections to go back to.
On Monday, President Trump threatened to block the opening of a new Canadian-built bridge across the Detroit River. He wants Canada to hand at least half ownership of the bridge to the U.S., among other unspecified demands. This is the Gordie Howe International Bridge. It's named for a Houston Hockey Hall of Famer who apparently was Canadian and also played a bit for the Detroit Red Wings. I don't know about the details there. The project, again, paid for by Canada, was negotiated by former Michigan Governor Rick Snyder, who is a Republican. So what is this about?
Once again, the sticking point with Canada, the issues of tariffs and trade, and it gives the Trump administration some leverage. There's also been some lobbying. There's another bridge there, and the Ambassador Bridge, which is the historic bridge crossing over to Windsor, that's owned by someone, and it's a private bridge. And that owner has been lobbying the Trump administration to keep this bridge from opening because it's direct competition.
Aha. So this is somebody who has curried favor with the administration, trying to gum up the works.
Yeah.
Tomorrow, the Trump administration plans to rescind a 2009 EPA endangerment finding that determined pollutants from developing and burning fossil fuels like methane and carbon dioxide can be regulated under the Clean Air Act. What will this formal decision mean?
It will essentially decimate any protections that we have in terms of pollutants.
Well, at least in Houston, we don't have any refineries or any petrochemical plants, so it's probably not going to affect us that much.
Just shallow breaths, everybody, for a while, I guess. Renee Cross is Senior Director of the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston. Mark Jones is a Political Science Fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Thank you both.
Thanks, Craig.
Craig.